All right, in this lecture, we're going to look at, oh, I have an email, uh, a different type of argument. So in the past few lectures, we've looked at arguments for God's existence, and we've assessed the strengths and weaknesses of those various arguments. So we've looked at, the ontological argument, which, if you recall, has an a priori argument, has an a priori premises, and then we also looked at the causal argument and the contingency arguments, which have a posteriori premises. And you should know what those terms mean by now. We're going to look at a different type of argument today, and this isn't an argument for God's existence. Instead, this is an argument against God's existence, and it's called the problem of evil, or specifically, we're looking at the logical problem of evil. And this argument says that the existence of evil is inconsistent with the existence of God. Of course, we'll have to formulate that more precisely, which we're going to do soon. So we're going to look at the argument today, the premises for it, and then we're going to look at ways theists might respond to that as well. Well, take two propositions that theists affirm. We'll call one Proposition G. An omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect God exists. So omnipotent means all-powerful. Omni is the Latin for all. Potent means powerful. You've heard of impotence, which is a problem that has a pharmaceutical solution these days. Impotence means lack of power. Omnipotence means like fully powerful, all-powerful, not lacking in any power whatsoever. It's the complete opposites of impotence. And impotence isn't just referred to as a problem that has to be solved by a blue pill. It refers to just if you lack a power to do some type of thing, then you're impotent with respect to that. So, for example, I, as a human being, could not stick my finger in a pot of water and then have the water instantly start boiling. I don't have the type of causal power necessary to make water boil. A stove, on the other hand, does. If I put it on a stove and flick the switch and turn on the burner on high, the water will eventually boil. So with respect to boiling water, I'm impotent, I guess, with respect to that. Omniscient means all-knowing. Again, omni. It's Latin for all or every. And then scient comes from the Latin word scio, which just means to know. God is all-knowing. God knows everything. That's just what it is to be God, is to know every single thing. And then morally perfect. And I don't think I need to explain that. That's just what theists have traditionally affirmed about God. God is, this really super, super, duper, duper good guy, right? All right. The next proposition is E. There is evil. This isn't a proposition that theists embrace, but it's a proposition that we have to affirm. And we'll explain that later. But yeah, there's no deny it. There's evil stuff going on in the world right now. There's bad stuff that happens. Well, some philosophers argue that G and E are inconsistent. So, that means either G or E must be false. And we're going to explain in some depth today what I mean by inconsistent. It's important that you understand this. So Woody Allen's not a philosopher, but if you haven't seen his movies, I highly encourage you to do it. He's one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And some of his movies have explored many theological and philosophical themes. And Woody Allen is also a very famous atheist who probably joins the chorus of philosophers who say that G and E are inconsistent. All right, well, E is most certainly true, according to these philosophers. Or you can recall, E says that there is evil. Well, since E is most certainly true, the atheist philosopher says that G then must be false. And the reason, again, is because E and G are inconsistent. So if E is true, G has to be false. Well, this can be expressed via the following argument. Now, way back in Unit 1, when we talked about various argument forms, there was a form that you've seen throughout the semester that has the fancy term modus ponens, but it's a pretty simple argument form that you use every day. And it can be expressed like this. Premise 1, if there is evil in the world, then God does not exist. Premise 2, there is evil in the world. Conclusion, so God does not exist. Fairly straightforward argument. Now, to challenge the argument, you have to challenge one of the premises. Woo! I'm under the weather right now, if you couldn't already tell by how nasally my voice is. All right, well, we should unpack what we mean by inconsistency for a while. The atheist is claiming that G and E are inconsistent. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, two or more propositions are inconsistent if it is impossible that they all be true at the same time. Well, so when two or more propositions are inconsistent, they can't all be true. Well, inconsistency comes in two types of varieties. There are two ways for propositions to be inconsistent. One would be when the two propositions are contradictories, and the second way would be when they are contraries. Well, let's take a look at contradictories. Two propositions are contradictory if it is impossible for them both to be true, and it's impossible for them both to be false. So, in other words, when two propositions contradict each other, it must be the case that one is true and the other is false. So a contradiction is like a really, really strong type of inconsistency. If one proposition is true, then the other one must be false. But if the other one's false, then the other one must be true. Well, for example, let proposition 1 be the proposition that all humans are mortal, and let proposition 2 be the proposition that it is false that all humans are mortal. Well, if proposition 1 is true, proposition 2 has to be false. But if proposition 1 is false, proposition 2 has to be true. Well, why am I talking about this? This will make sense when we get to contraries. So, with two propositions that contradict each other, it is impossible for, say, P1 and P2 to both be true, and it is impossible for them to both be false. Again, if it's false that all humans are mortal, that just means that it's true that all humans are mortal. I'm sorry, if it's false that all humans are mortal, that just means that it's true that it is not the case that all humans are mortal. Because P2 is just the negation. Whoops. The P2 is the negation of P1. And my computer is, there we go. So, if it's false that it is not the case that all humans are mortal, then all humans are immortal. P2, again, negates P1, but P1 is logically equivalent to the double negation P1 hyphen, it is not the case that all humans are mortal. Confused yet? Well, my suggestion is that you pull up these PowerPoint slides, go to this slide, and think about it for a minute. It's not really that complicated. But you might have to slow down for a second to understand it, but you should be able to understand what I'm saying. Alright, by the way, proposition 1 is true. All humans are mortal. We're all going to die. I'm sorry. Unless you're good at Twister, that is.
Right hand green. Left hand red. Right foot green. Dude. Yeah. Well, I will take you back.
I hope you've all seen Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. It's a classic. So, P1 and P2, recall, are explicitly contradictory, since P2 is just the negation of P1. P1, recall, says all men are mortal. P2 says it is not the case that all men are mortal. Some propositions, though, are only implicitly contradictory. So, let P3 be the proposition that Fred is a bachelor, and let P4 be the proposition that Fred is married. Well, P3 and P4 also contradict each other, but the contradiction's implicit. So, recall that a bachelor is an unmarried adult human male. Well, we need some further premise then that all bachelors are unmarried, which expresses a necessary condition of some X's being a bachelor. And with that further premise, we can drive the contradiction. So we can argue it this way then. Premise 1, Fred is a bachelor. Premise 2, all bachelors are unmarried. Conclusion, so Fred is unmarried. Well, the conclusion is that Fred is unmarried, but then that contradicts P4. Recall, P4 is a proposition that Fred is married. This is if Fred is a bachelor, then he's unmarried. But if he's unmarried, then he cannot be married. So Fred cannot be a bachelor and married at the same time. So that would be two implicitly contradictory propositions, and how you go about proving that they're contradictory. And with implicitly contradictory propositions, you always need a further premise. Well, now let's take a look at contraries. So if you recall, way back when I said that there are two ways for propositions to be consistent. One, contradictories. Two, contraries. Now we're going to take a look at contraries. Well, two propositions are contraries if it is impossible that both be true, but it is possible that both be false. So recall, when two propositions are contradictory, they both can't be true and they both can't be false. Well, when they're just contraries, while they both can't be true, they can both be false. Here's an example. Let proposition 5 be the proposition that all the coins in Davis's pockets are dimes. And let proposition 6 be the proposition that all the coins in Davis's pockets are nickels. So proposition 5 and proposition 6 are contraries. If P5 is true, then P6 is false, and vice versa. But, however, it doesn't follow that if P5 is false, that P6 is true, for P5 and P6 could both be false. For example, while it's false that all the coins in my pockets are dimes, it can also be false that all the coins are nickels. Instead, the coins could be quarters or pennies or a mix of all four kinds of American currency, or some other type of currency. So P5 and P6 are contraries, not contradictories. And they're contraries because while both can't be true, both can be false. So this is an important point that you need to remember. Two propositions do not actually have... Well, here's another important point. Two propositions do not actually have to be true to be consistent. Instead, it only needs to be logically possible that they both be true. So we're making on to a different point. Consistency is a point about what's logically possible. Okay? Here's an example. Take the proposition P7. Santa Claus exists. Well, that's consistent with the proposition P8. The Easter Bunny exists. Even though those are actually both false, probably, propositions. It's probably not the case that Santa Claus exists. And it's probably not the case that the Easter Bunny exists. I'm sorry for those of you who are only hearing this for the first time. It's probably a hard thing to hear, but I told you that Intro to Philosophy is not an easy course. And in many ways, it's hard. So that's an example. Those are two propositions that are consistent, even though they're both probably false. So false propositions can be consistent with each other. It only has to be logically possible that they're both be true. And it's certainly logically possible that Santa Claus exists, as well as logically possible that the Easter Bunny exists. Well, take the proposition P10 that Santa Claus sings at the North Pole. That proposition, however, is inconsistent with the proposition P11 that no one sings at the North Pole. Well, here's a question. Which proposition is false? P10 or P11?
I'm singing! I'm in a store and I'm singing! I'm in a store and I'm singing!
Hey! There's no singing in the North Pole.
Yes, there is!
No, it's not.
We sing all the time!
No, it's not.
Especially when we make toys!
Well, how can you tell when propositions are inconsistent? Well, again, if they're explicitly contradictory, then you could just simply see straight off that they're contradictory. One's usually the negation of the other. But if they're implicitly contradictory, it's a bit more difficult. Well, the best method when to see if two propositions are inconsistent is to derive what's called an explicit contradiction from them. Recall how we derived an explicit contradiction from P3, Jones is a bachelor, and P4, Jones is married. We did so by using a necessary truth as an extra premise. all bachelors are unmarried, which expresses a necessary condition of some X's being a bachelor. But here's an important point. In saying that two propositions are inconsistent, it is logically impossible that both propositions be true. Thus, we should not use propositions that are possibly false or just contingent. So, for example, here's an example of a contingent proposition. Well, I'm sorry, here's an example of a necessary proposition. In every possible world where Jones is a bachelor, it is false that Jones is married. Because being an unmarried bachelor is a necessary condition of being a bachelor. If it are only true in some possible worlds that bachelors are unmarried, then it could be true in some possible worlds that Jones is a bachelor and married. But that's absurd. It's a necessary truth that bachelors are unmarried. That's how you define bachelor. It's just a part of the definition of it. So that can't happen. Being a married bachelor would be like 2 plus 2 being 5. It just can't happen. So this is the rule then. To demonstrate that two propositions are logically inconsistent, which means they're either going to be contraries or implicit contradictories, you have to derive an explicit contradiction from the propositions using only logically necessary truths together with the propositions. Well, why can't we use contingent premises to derive an explicit contradiction from two propositions? Well, let's take a look at an example. Suppose that there are a scientific study that shows that all bachelors are of higher than average intelligence. Would that entail that the two propositions P11, Jones is a bachelor, and P13, Jones is as dumb as a brick, are inconsistent? Well, someone might argue as follows. Premise 1, all bachelors are of higher than average intelligence. Premise 2, Jones is a bachelor. Conclusion, so Jones is of higher than average intelligence. Well, that conclusion 3 does contradict P13, which says that Jones is dumb as a brick. Recall, Jones is a bachelor. But they're not really logically inconsistent, because there are possible worlds where it's false that bachelors are of higher than average intelligence. It's not a part of the definition or the meaning of the word bachelor that you be smart. It just means that you're an adult, unmarried human male. So that's contingent, that they just so happen to be smarter in our actual world. If that's the case, I don't even know. All right, we have concluded part 1. Turn to the next lecture for part 2 of the logical problem of evil.